We have before us the job of dealing with whether or not there is existing in the federal government today sufficient authority to deal with systemic risk. There are several aspects to that. We talked considerably about one of them on Tuesday with the chairman and secretary of the Treasury, namely the need to have somewhere in the federal government the ability to use the bankruptcy authority given by the U.S. Constitution to wind down an important non-bank financial institution. We have long had in our laws an adaptation of bankruptcy to wind down banks. And when banks have failed, while it has been sometimes painful, it has not been as disruptive as when the non-bank financial institutions have failed. And the two glaring examples are Lehman Brothers, where nothing was done, and AIG, where everything was done. And I believe we are looking for an alternative method to avoid those two polar extremes. That is a bankruptcy authority which can honor some and not honor others. It has some discretion. The question of compensation is part of that, as is the question of whether or not people should continue to be allowed to securitize 100% of loans. Today, our focus will be on the fourth of these, although obviously members are free to bring up whatever they wish, and that is, do we need to increase the authority of some entity or entities in the federal government to restrict excessive leverage? We are talking in the resolving authority about what happens when there is a failure on the part of an institution that is so heavily indebted to so many parties that simply allowing it to fail without intervention could cause magnifying negative effects. But obviously the preferential situation would be to keep that from happening. And this assumes a lot of other issues, whether or not people are too big to fail or too interconnected to fail. The goal should be, and obviously no system is going to prevent all failures because it would then be too restrictive, but the goal is to minimize the likelihood that entities will get so heavily indebted, so heavily leveraged, with inadequate resources in case there is a need to make the payments, that their lack of success threatens the whole system. I believe that we are in the third phase here of a set of phenomena we've seen in American economic history. It's a phenomenon in which the private sector innovates, and innovations which have no real value added die of their own weight. But innovations that add value thrive, as they should, because we are dependent on the dynamism of the private sector to improve our wealth, to increase our wealth. But by definition, when this comes from significant innovation, there aren't rules that contain abuses. The goal of public policy is to come up with rules that set a fair playing field, that constrain abuses, that protect legitimate and responsible entities from irresponsible competition that can draw them away from good practices, while having as little effect as possible on diminishing the value. Thus, in the late 19th century, the trusts were created, and they were very important. We would not have industrialized without those large enterprises in oil and coal and steel and a number of other areas. But because they were new, they operated without restraint. So the Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, with more help, I think, than he gets credit for from William Howard Taft, set rules. The Antitrust Act, the Federal Trade Commission, the creation of the Federal Reserve. Those were rules that tried to preserve the large industrial enterprise. Indeed, there were people who tried to get Woodrow Wilson to break them up. And they give a value added that we need, but we need rules. That led to a great increase in the importance of the stock market, because you now had enterprises that could not be financed individually. And the job of Franklin Roosevelt and his colleagues during the 30s was to set rules that allowed us to get the benefit of the finance capitalism of the stock market, but curtailed some of the abuses. I believe that securitization and the great increase in the ability to send money around the world that comes from both the pools of liquidity and the technology, CDOs and credit default swaps, these are a set of innovations on a par with the earlier set, and they have had great value. Securitization, which allows money to be relent and relent and relent without it having to all be repaid, greatly magnifies the value of money. But there are problems, as there were with the trust or with the stock market, when there are no rules. Our job is to craft rules as did Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, that allow the society to get the benefit of these wonderful value-added financial innovations while curtailing some of the abuses. The